and I'm the Creative Development Director at Gray Area, in which capacity I run the Education, Artist Incubator, and Research Labs. I am here on the stage to introduce Caroline Sinders, who I have had the pleasure of working with over the past few years at Gray Area. Caroline is an award-winning critical designer, researcher, and artist. For the past few years, she has been examining the intersections of artificial intelligence, intersectional justice, systems design, harm, and politics in digital conversational spaces and technology platforms. She has worked with the United Nations, Amnesty International, IBM Watson, the Wikimedia Foundation, and others. She has a pretty extensive bio, but what I wanted to tell you about her is that we are super excited not to just welcome her to this talk she's about to give you, but we have been co-designing a curriculum with Caroline called the Responsible Technology Design Intensive. That's a 10-week course that takes students through exploring all the different elements of ethical technology design. And we have a few other people that are involved. Hey, Diem and Sarah, sorry, what was her last name? Sarah Aoun. So we have some amazing teachers. Caroline's in charge of this whole thing. It's part of a grant we have with the Hewlett Foundation. So we are super excited for that to start in the coming months. It's gonna be coming up very soon. And I'm just super, like, Caroline is the person if you want to learn and understand about bias, harm reduction, and safety online. So without further ado, I would like to welcome my friend and colleague, Caroline Sinders, to the stage.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Nikki. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Sinders. Nikki gave a fantastic introduction. I'm Caroline. I'm an artist and researcher, and one of the things I like to sort of start with is why I take such an interdisciplinary approach. And so part of that is my background. My background is in photojournalism, and then I got a master's in design and technology. So like by combining photojournalism, research, design, and art, I see everything through this lens of legibility and research storytelling, which are skills I honed as a photojournalist. And so with these skills, I make art and I do human rights research, focusing through the lens of how design and technology affect people in their everyday lives. And this is my current workflow. This is how I approach problem solving across everything I do. I want to make research, and that includes even things like data or data sets, because I find research to be practical. It can create something that wasn't there before, it can test a hypothesis to see if it works or if it doesn't. But then the next step is activism, because it builds off that practical research. And activism is helpful, it helps push society forward. But finally, I take that activism and research and I distill it into something else, which is art. A poetry that is necessary to help the world function. It can help create new future imaginaries, pulling from these two other steps. Another way I think of my art is something I call research-driven art, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's art that's shaped and driven by research, be it quantitative or qualitative. Often people, or I think an immediate assumption we make with something like research-driven art is that it could be data-driven or data visualization. But I don't make data visualization, but I could. But a way I think about it is, what if you made net art or technology-based art with the same principles as photojournalism? So like photojournalism, research-driven art uses specific structures and a sense of purpose to constrain it. These constraints work much like how a skeleton works. While they stabilize the practice just as a rib cage stabilizes the body, they do not define the entire practice nor keep it from moving and flexing on its own. So in this way, the research I do stabilizes and shapes my art, but it does not dictate the outcome. Okay, good, these GIFs are playing because I can't see the GIFs playing. I don't have eyes on the back of my head. In late May 2020, after the United States erupted in protest for Black Lives Matter and after George Floyd's death, I saw a number of curators and critics remark on social network about the role of tech artists in unpacking technology and justice and activism. But most of the technology artists they were mentioning happened to be white and male, which is something I made a note of. So I reached out over email to my friend, the curator and writer Nora Khan, and we started discussing artistic practices during moments of cultural upheaval. So in this email, Nora wrote to me, quote, "How might critical technological work be called on in this moment to do more? Coded design work has that capacity. Hybrid research practices can explain and expose the logics of racial capitalism, but under the auspices of artistic collaboration, can enact critique, make an argument through process, and through a built system. So this idea of usefulness in interdisciplinary work is a key and necessary part of a research-driven arts practice. And it's directly, extremely inspired by Tanya Bruguera's arte utile methodology, which means utilitarian art. Arte utile draws on artistic thinking to imagine and create and implement tactics that can change how we act in society. Again, heavily focused on usefulness, on tool building, and on communities. This is something Nora also highlighted in her email, talking about the strengths of work that can stretch across many different domains. In her words, making art this necessary Trojan horse to discuss useful change. This is where I turn to the work of American artists Francis Singh, Joanna Mull, Adam Harvey, Mimi Anoha, forensic architecture, and others. These artists are pulling from a research or investigatory-based practices and with work that manifests into a variety of outputs, artifacts, writings, and educations. And all of those outputs we can think of as artistic outputs, even if it's not like a hard art artifact. A workshop or an artifact of education can be a part of an arts practice. I also, this is where we can look at the practices, perhaps together, of American artists or Stop Spying LA as two related practices, even though they're from two different groups and two different practitioners, because they're both great examples of a social justice and human rights-driven art practice, with Stop Spying's work focusing on community organizing against surveillance and the police in Los Angeles, or American artists' work, I'm Blue, If I Was Blank, I Would Die, and My Blue Window, two pieces that comment on the structure and violence of modern police forces. And so, under this space of research-driven art and arte utile, these works are much closer together than they are farther apart. Other examples of a social justice, research, and artistic practice are works like The Hidden Life of an Amazon User by Joanna Mull, or Adam Harvey's V-Frame research, which came out of his numerous collaborations with the human rights archiving group Mnemonic, formerly known as the Syrian Archive, or the investigative work of forensic architecture. One example of a research and social justice-based art practice is Mimi Anoha's. Anoha's research work on the politics and injustices of data sets have resulted in artworks like the Library of Missing Data Sets and the zine and educational tool, The People's Guide to AI, co-written with Diana J. Nucera. These pieces and artists occupy a liminal space of research journalism and art. And this is where I start to think of these two perhaps being combined, of an arts practice and a design practice. And so looking at this research-driven art, I start to look at this through the lens of design, which often prompts, why design? Because everything around us is design, from how we physically entered this room to how in a later panel there will be a Zoom meeting, to why we can or cannot block people on Slack, we can't block them, and how information is presented to us on Twitter and how the world surrounds us. Design is incredibly political when we think of how it manifests into everything we can touch. This slide is a cheeky nod to Don Norman and the design of everyday objects. And in the design world, there's this assumption that design is universal, seamless, and intuitive, when it is most definitely not. In some cases, design makes these doors appear they function one way. So why does design matter when we talk about technology or digital harm? Because design can elevate and obfuscate. Design isn't a skill, but a practice and a language in and of itself. So to start solving problems around complex issues and creating spaces for human connection, design needs to also be at the equal forefront of this conversation. Design is what distills code and policy into digestible and interactive and understandable interfaces for users. So design is that thing that explains what code and policy are outlining. I think we can see this in online harassment reporting interstitials. The idea here is that users don't have to deeply understand a social network's policy on harassment in order to report it. Design takes the technical infrastructure, the actual ability to select a piece of content, click on it, and then click on what bucket it falls into, as well as the political infrastructure, the policy, what kind of harassment or harm the content falls into, and describing the platform policy in a way that's short and understandable to users, and then folds all of that into product design, the harassment reporting system. Security settings are another example. For users to report content, they shouldn't have to be a lawyer, and to adjust security settings, they shouldn't have to be an engineer. So design makes these complexities understandable. Design affects things like policy. For example, in an area of deceptive design, or also known as dark patterns. Dark patterns are design patterns that unintentionally or intentionally trick users into making decisions they normally wouldn't make, and have started to be focused on finally in the policy circles just only over the last 2 or 3 years. This is something that designers have known about for years. One of the things I want to show, for example, right now is how design affects policy. This is an example of a pop-up from the European Union's GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. This is a very common dark pattern we still see today. Oop. Is it? Not sure what happened. I'll keep going. Okay, so you see 2 buttons here. One is accept all cookies. It really sticks out to you. But this sort of looks like almost like a binary choice. You can either accept or click on cookie settings to learn more. But when you click, that's where the actual sort of more consensual, more legible buttons are hidden. So this is what makes this a dark pattern. The actual consent button, if you want to opt out, is hidden. So then why design? Can a door be political? I think it can be. Can it be art? Perhaps. Well, what does art do? It transports us, it's poetic, it analogizes, it creates artifacts of visual interpretation. It's not necessarily direct or didactic, but it can be. It is different from design, but it also aims to achieve different things. How can design be art? So for me, I was raised in the United States and I went to school in the US. And so the way that design has always been sort of shown and articulated to me is design is useful but profitable and exists in a different space than art. But design is so much more than that and affects so much more than that. This is where I turn to critical design and speculative design. Critical design is design that addresses the limitations of product design and was a term coined in 1997 by Anthony Dunn, and it comes from a practice he developed with Fiona Raby when they were research fellows at the Royal College of Art. Critical design demands that design stop existing in terms of capitalist production, where it is a function of just product design. Instead, push product design towards self-examination and cultural critique. By redefining how product design can be created, critical design also creates new ways for an audience to engage with design and understand all different facets of design in their everyday lives. So again, this is where it all comes together. So we can look at the work of Dunn and Raby, Mimi Onoha, Adam Harvey, Forensic Architecture, or American Artist, and we can view these works solely as art or as research, but they're much more richly seen when viewed together as this interdisciplinary practice. And again, this is where design and art come together. The works aren't just to bear witness, though that alone would be worthwhile. They question and provocate, and sometimes offer a potential solution to a problem. But this should not be viewed as a form of techno-solutionism. These solutions the artists provide are not meant to create an end-all, be-all to other solutions, but serve to rather offer temporary or open-source fixes for gaps in inequity and violence created by society, and thus become poetic witnesses of those gaps. This is a kind of Band-Aid in a similar space where I pursue my own practice. Band-Aids exist as necessary provocations or patches, while participatory design, deconstruction, with artists, human rights researchers, activists, and technologists can overhaul the system or destroy systems together. This togetherness and collaboration is key, though, but nonetheless, provocations within art and design can create imaginaries for new realities. I'm going to quickly show you some projects and where they came from. One of the things I also sort of want to ground this in is I've spent the past almost actually now 9 years studying online harassment and thinking about how systems create harassment. I look at the affordances of technology. Do UX and UI decisions mitigate harassment? Can they amplify it? And then how does that affect the policy around things like online harassment? And I think that design does affect areas of allowing users to create safety. Think about if you were being harassed. What does the system actually allow you to do? What can you do to create safety in that space, and can you actually be safe? Some of my research focuses on the harassment of everyday users and then journalists who face really large threats like governmental censorship or surveillance, and all the way down to what we can think of as sadly more regular harassment, and then things like harassment campaigns. This research has been supported by a variety of different organizations, and this research work also inspires art as well. I'm going to show you a few different projects. So this is something I worked with Hyphen Labs on in 2019 called Higher Resolutions when we were the lead artists for the Tate Exchange at the Tate Modern. Higher Resolutions ran for 2 weeks in 2019, and we used interactive artwork and talks and workshops from artists, international technology experts to examine the state of power and privacy online, from widespread surveillance to how AI is shaping human culture and relationships to threats from emerging technology that can pose to human rights. Artists and speakers came from Amnesty International, the BBC, the Carnegie Trust, Article 19, and Privacy International, and other organizations. A major reason I was so excited to work with Hyphen Labs, other than that they're very good friends and really wonderful people, was the ability to bring policy researchers and political activists and watchdog groups directly into our artistic collaboration and have that set in a very specific institutional setting. It's important when creating activist and social justice work as artists to avoid replicating unintentionally work done by activists out in the field. Instead, we can work directly with those activists. So when fighting things like data surveillance, a way to create change is to work together and create new levers of pressure in the public, and arts institutions are a necessary part of that lever. We need to avoid creating work done alone in the space of art and seek collaboration with other activists and researchers working on identical causes and issues. And so another example of a research-driven arts practice is my own project, Feminist Dataset, which started in 2017 as a response to the many documented cases of problems in technology and bias in machine learning. It's a critical research and art project that examines every step of the machine learning pipeline using intersectional feminism as the framework of investigation. And we are inspired by the Maker Movement, the Critical Engineering Manifesto, and APC's Feminist Principles of the Internet. If you don't know APC, I definitely recommend checking them out. They're a human rights NGO focusing mainly on the majority world, and they've put out a lot of really important work on data feminism, feminist infrastructure, feminist technology, and feminist principles of the Internet. So Feminist Dataset is this multi-year project. It's trans-inclusive and focusing on racial justice, but it's extremely process-driven, so the outputs of the project, or the artifacts, are workshops on data and machine learning. The workshops are key since they're a mechanism to think through what community-driven, equitable data collection could look like. In the workshops, we discuss, well, what is intersectional data? What does it mean? What is an intersectional way to gather data, along with like the data itself that we're gathering? We talk about Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work, the creator of the term intersectionality. But because it's a text-based data set, we also have to unpack, well, what is intersectionality in writing? For example, let's take an article about income inequality. An intersectional feminist article would highlight that white women, black women, indigenous women, Latina women, and trans folks of all different races are paid different amounts. So an article that simply represents all women as a monolith is not intersectional and cannot be in the data set. So the project is sort of like the antithesis of normal data collection. It's really about slow data. You have to really read and think about, well, does intersectionality actually manifest into the text itself versus is the article on something that feels feminist? Within our workshops, community members then research and submit written data, be it poems, texts, blogs, transcripts of conversations, whatever. The only time my hand as the creator appears is to remove non-intersectional data, and I'm extremely firm about this. Racists and TERFs need not apply. And Feminist Dataset operates in a similar vein to Thomas Twait's toaster project, which you see here, a critical design project in which Twaits builds a commercial toaster from scratch, from melting iron ore to creating a new plastic toaster body mold. And Feminist Dataset is taking this critical and artistic view on software. What does it mean to thoughtfully make with machine learning, to carefully consider every angle of making, iterating, and designing? Every step of this process needs to be thoroughly re-examined, and like Twait's toaster, it has to actually work. But also like the toaster, my software will be as misshapen as this toaster. Part of the project is dealing with failure. Can you actually have feminist technology? What are the concessions you make? For example, we are having to use AWS. I'm using a Mac laptop. Is this a piece of feminist technology? Probably not. So part of it is also dealing with where does ideology sort of meet the reality of making, and what are those concessions? So it's not afraid of failure, but instead sort of greeting that and stating, even if we have these best intentions, this is what it actually looks like when you start to apply it. A second iteration of Feminist Dataset is called TRK, or Technically Responsible Knowledge. Is that going? Yeah? There we go. Okay, cool. Sorry, I was like, is it playing? I don't know. Who knows? TRK is an open source project that examines wage inequality and creates an open source alternative to data labeling and training, which is a part of the Feminist data set. Now focusing on data labeling, which is what we have to do with our data set, sort of clean our data set, label it to eventually generate a model. So we're looking at the systemic issues around labor and invisibility and the creation of maintaining data structures and training data algorithmic models. TRK was funded by the Mozilla Foundation and was created with Kade Diem, Ian Arnaud Fuma, and Rainbow Unicorn. And we started a lot of this work in 2019, where I interviewed research labs and artists and startups who use Mechanical Turk-style services and microservice workers across Crowdflower, Fiverr, Mechanical Turk. I even became a Mechanical Turker myself for a few months. So TRK is this alternative on dataset training and labeling, which is a time-consuming but integral aspect of machine learning that must be completed in part by a human. The tool offers a wage calculator to help visualize a livable wage for those that would be completing the tasks. So as an artist who uses AI as a material to make and explore art, I was struck by how many startups, research labs, and artists use Mechanical Turk-style platforms without that much thought given to the payment structure determined for workers on the network. So Mechanical Turk and similar platforms have well-documented cases of horrendous worker-related issues, such as severely underpaid contracts. In many instances, if a lab or individual is trying to price equitably, the interface of Mechanical Turk works against it, since it's not including time of the task. So, for example, say I asked one of you to help me deinstall gray area, and I said, oh, I'm going to pay you $100. If it's a 5-minute, deinstall, that's a really good deal, but if it's 3 days, that's not a great deal at all. So time has this really direct impact in terms of how we think about pricing. If the machine learning pipeline is death by 1,000 cuts, I think of TRK as one very, very small Band-Aid for one very, very small cut. Because the project doesn't propose a solution for all issues related to machine learning, or even a major one for Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Because so many issues related to machine learning are issues of a deeper, more ingrained societal inequity that can only be addressed perhaps through large shifts and restructuring in society or legislation. But within that, as a designer and artist, I try to look at what kinds of research work can help elevate or expose those issues. So TRK focuses on how through pricing structures, platform incentives, and the invisible nature of gig work, clients underprice, undervalue, and fundamentally misunderstand how tasks are handled in these human-as-a-service platforms. So part of the design thinking behind TRK is trying to examine equity and transparency within interfaces in the design of tools and what kinds of problems UX and UI create in technology. We're inspired by the data sheets for datasets white paper, so TRK injects plain text information into the dataset with information that includes a description of what a dataset is and when it was made. User experience design is a utilitarian intelligence, focusing on architectural layouts, usability, and user flow. But design has a politics to it. It can suppress or uplift content. Design, much like technology, isn't neutral. So as an artist, I use design as a material to confront and comment on the slickness and inequity of for-profit technologies. So one of the things I think a lot about is the role of a designer and where we sort of sit. And I think design is a tool much like technology and much like art, and it can create political small acts of resistance and change. What kinds of design can we make when we stop viewing it through a Western Silicon Valley neoliberal and capitalist lens? We've seen code and art made without the constraints of capitalism, and it's time for design to do that as well. So critical design, social justice, and design justice are needed now more than ever for tool making, and it's time for design to confront how it's perpetuated white supremacy and change its relationships to power. Design can be an actuator for change, but design alone is not an entire solution towards confronting injustice in society. Design needs to confront that it has a problem while acknowledging it's a part of the problem. Design can help visualize or highlight parts of systemic injustice, but design must unpack its role in contributing to injustice in technology, especially in Silicon Valley. I use design as an artistic practice and as a lever to create usefulness to explore problem solving. And I think there's one of the tools that really sticks out to me that also does something similar is Everest Pimpkin's tool to blur images for people to use at protests. So design and tool making can sit in a space to solve small problems that are part of a bigger space and bigger issues. So my approach to design thinking is proposing a decommodification of art and situating it in a process of investigation. Artistic approaches to problems allow for collaborations that might not happen in other fields. And in this way, art's role in social justice and human rights projects makes space for new kinds of work in a way that other fields traditionally could not let those projects exist. What does change look like? It has to be interdisciplinary across many fields of art, activism, policy, and social justice working together and not separately. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Okay, sweet. You guys should all check out Caroline's piece in the back. It's called Within the Terms and Conditions, and it represents a really laborious research project where Caroline explored the violations of YouTube's terms and conditions.